Hi, I'm Mr. Kufs. We're doing a weekly recap of topics 3.7, 3.8, and we're going to touch a little bit on 3.9, but do most of that in next week's recap. So we're going to talk about the 1780s. We're going to go back in time to the 1780s. So to set the stage, the Treaty of Paris is the treaty that ended the American Revolution, and it gave us all the land to the Mississippi River, and it recognized us by Great Britain in the world as the United States of America. And we think, yay, this is great, we're our own country, this is really exciting, we won this war, and it's just great. But the problem is that we set up a government that was painfully weak. And that government's called the Articles of Confederation, and it was governed by our legislative branch. The only branch of government we had was Congress. And Congress had very little power. And the reason was because they intentionally didn't want us to be like Britain. So we didn't have the power to tax. We didn't have the power to make treaties with other countries as a country. We didn't have a power to settle border disputes. We didn't have courts. We couldn't amend the document because the document needed all 13 states to agree, and they never agreed. We couldn't even pass laws because it needed 2/3 of a vote, and even that was impossible. So the Articles of Confederation, with the exception of the negotiation of the treaty and of the ordinances, the Northwest Ordinance and Land Ordinance that gave criteria to Western statehood, the Articles of Confederation, in one word, a word that we talk about, what's the word? It was what? What were the Articles? Weak. The Articles were weak. And we call the 1780s the critical period. It was critical because we as a country are either going to live or we're going to die. And so, historically speaking, we're at a really bad time where we can't even stop the country that we just went to war with, England, from building out in our west. And we can't even stop the French, and we can't even stop American Indians, and we can't even stop some farmer from Massachusetts and his friends from hijacking the country for 6 months. Shays' Rebellion. And so all of this is really something that the framers of the Constitution, the influential white men that are running things at this point, recognize. It's kind of like an oh crap moment, like, oh my gosh, we set up a government that stinks. But we had to, we didn't want to be like Britain. So it's this weird balance, like how do we rectify this without becoming the very government that we hate? And so Washington, the most important and influential American at the time, the hero of the American Revolution, calls delegates from all the states to his house in Mount Vernon. Only 4 of the 13 states send anyone. So they're like, let's get everyone here and meet. So a year later, we have a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, and only 5 show up. So we recognize there's a crisis here. And at least there's starting to be a rumbling of, let's just meet in Philly where we did the Declaration 11 years earlier. And in 1787, 55 delegates meet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for what will be known as a constitutional convention. And this document will be produced. They will fix the issues of the Articles of Confederation and its weakness without creating an oppressive tyranny. You follow me? How will they do that? Well, James Madison becomes the father of this, the architect of this. He does all his homework. George Washington is going to be the chairman of this meeting, and Ben Franklin, the elder statesman that sits in the back. Alexander Hamilton will be the insatiable writer that will help pitch it through Federalist Papers, along with Madison and a little bit John Jay, to try to advertise why the virtues of this are important. What is this? Well, we'll talk more next week, but this is about 3 separation of powers, 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. And the Bill of Rights is going to keep this from overstepping its boundary, but it's basically a document, a rule book, that's going to set what the United States is to its citizens. It starts with an introduction paragraph called a preamble, where they really give a thesis statement. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and then they say the 5 things the government will do. Establish justice, which means they'll have a court system. Okay? Secure the blessings of liberty that we won in the Revolution. Promote the general well-being of their people. Okay? That's what's happening here in the preamble. And ultimately, giving people domestic tranquility, that means peace at home. Providing for a common defense, that means funding a military. All of these things are going to be possible. It's going to start with taxes. They're going to need taxes to generate revenue. Are they just going to be federal taxes? Or are states going to have the power to tax too? Well, they all are, because they create a concept called federalism. And federalism is the division of power between state and federal government. I made a little video about that before, and that's what federalism is, and it's depicted by this Venn diagram. There are powers that are delegated to the federal government. I know if you're looking at the video, it's backwards. I'm sorry, there's no other way to do this. And then there's powers reserved to the states, and then there's concurrent powers that are both, like taxes, like courts, like roads and bridges. Okay? So ultimately, what they're going to do, though, is argue over compromises. And the biggest compromise is the Great Compromise. They're going to have to rectify the problem with one vote per state, because the bigger states felt like they weren't getting equal representation. But then the smaller states felt like if they did it with population, they wouldn't get equal representation. And ultimately, the Great Compromise will be the way they fix that by setting up a bicameral or two-chamber legislature. The small states will get the Senate, the big population states will get the House. We live in a world now where California and Texas have a lot more power in the House, and the small states have equal power, like Rhode Island and Delaware and Alaska and Hawaii in the Senate. And back then it was much of the same. We count people through a census, we decide. In the 1790s, it'll be every 10 years. But they argued over the role of slaves, and they decided on a ridiculous fraction of 3/5. The 3/5 compromise will be a compromise that for every 5 slaves, that'll count as 3. They also will have a slave trade compromise where they'll cut off the slave trade from Africa in 20 years. And so in summary, there is federalism in the Venn diagram. The last things that we talked about were the Electoral College Compromise, where they didn't want the states to get swallowed. What, we're taping? What's up? Oh yeah, you're fine. She's going to art class. Sorry for the delay. And so we came up with this Electoral College, where we took the amount of reps, the amount of senators, added them together, and that's how many electoral votes each state got, for the purpose of maintaining state sovereignty and not letting large population bases control the narrative, and having a mechanism. The compromise was so that our president didn't become like a king. How are they going to get this thing ratified? To ratify means to pass. Okay? They need the states to ratify it. They're going to pitch it through what I already mentioned, the Federalist Papers. They're going to add the Bill of Rights. So we'll pick that up with 3.9, but we just answered the learning objectives for 3.7 and 3.8. That deals with the critical period in the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution itself. And that's a wrap up for this week. Thanks for coming out.
Bye.